Well, I actually had a formative experience as a child that I think led me into my field. I had a very nice childhood, no hard times until I was 12. And my father got cancer and died at that time. He was only 39. And that was, that would have been in 1964. And that was the time when you didn't tell the children, you protected the children. And they still had rules in the hospital where children under 12 were not supposed to be there. So he was in the hospital for, I think, from Halloween until December 10th when he died. And we only visited him, I had two younger brothers, we only visited him twice during that time. I remember talking to him on the phone, and he wasn't making much sense. And in retrospect, I know he must have been on a lot of pain medication. So then, we were being looked after by relatives and neighbors, and it was horrible. Our mom was never home. And I mean, we knew something bad was going on. But there was sort of the implication that, well, Dad has to be in the hospital for a while, and, at some point he would be better. I mean, that nobody ever said anything different, and that was our experience about doctors, right? You got better. So then one night we were there, and my mother came home with our minister, and they told us that he had died. And I remember I was shocked, but also there was a sense of, oh, that's what's been going on. And it was a little bit of a relief to have it made clear, because there had been this sense of brooding, just misfortune or hovering negativity. I remember I woke up once and I heard my grandmother was there, and I heard her crying. And so, I knew something bad, but nobody would ever sit down and tell us. So that really brought home to me the importance of being open even with children about this stuff. And I think that is now the thinking. I mean, you have to be careful about how you handle it, but I really think hearing a hard truth is better than being, quote, protected, because you're not being protected. I was always a very good student. I was the good little girl and got straight A's, and so I liked school. I loved to read. I learned to read before school, and my mother used to yell at me because I'd read during recess, and she wanted me to be more social. So I became more social, but I think I've always been an introvert, and I've always loved books. I read everything I could get my hands on, novels mainly. Probably some inappropriate things for my age. But I was talking, some friends and I were talking about Gone with the Wind the other day, and I remember reading that when I was visiting my great aunt, and I must have maybe been 13, probably, not that old. And I couldn't put it down, so I was reading it into the late hours down in the bedroom, and I just remembered crying my eyes out after I finished. So I think I'm a bookish sort. I came from the Midwest, and it might have been different if my father hadn't died, but my mother was very careful about not overpraising us, trying not to make us arrogant, and so also I think probably just she was kind of overwhelmed, and so there was never, I mean, she knew I did well in school. The assumption was I would go to college, and whatever I did, whatever. So I was interested in psychology and sociology, and so I majored in those. And then I graduated in 3 years, and I wasn't sure what to do with myself, so I signed up for a master's in counseling, because I was at Indiana University, and their psychology department was very behaviorist oriented. So if I had gone to grad school there, that would have been the emphasis, and that wasn't my thing. It was more like a delaying tactic, you know. And then I was a welfare worker for a year, and I found that very enlightening, but also frustrating, in that as a social worker type, I felt very impotent. So through friends and so forth, I thought, well, law school, that's something where there are a lot of different options after, and so I don't really have to commit. I remember writing on my application, I wanted to combine psychology and law. And you know how those things are. But I did, in law school, I would say, if I had a mentor, Harvard isn't the most mentorish place. It's a big, there are 530 some students in each class, and so it's big, and all the professors are doing very important things, but if I did have a mentor, it was Alan Stone, who is a psychiatrist, a psychoanalyst actually, no law degree, and he started teaching in the law school at Harvard early on. He used to do therapy for the professors. He had a couch in his office, and he taught all the courses I was interested in: law and medicine, law and psychiatry, and so I gravitated to him, and I took as many courses as I could in that area, although there weren't very many. I knew I didn't want to be a real lawyer. I didn't care about business A versus business B. I knew I would be very unhappy doing that.
So if you didn't want to be a real lawyer, what did law school do for you then?
Law school was great. I think it teaches you to read carefully, slowly. I'm a very fast reader. I still have to discipline myself to read slowly and really extricate all the information that's in there. That's the goal. Also see things from different sides. Try to pick out the broad principles that play a role in issues. I think it's an excellent education. Communicate clearly in writing as well as verbally. I'm not sure I do that well, but it really, I think, teaches people to be disciplined thinkers and communicators, which is something we'd like to see in everyone. Well, as I said, I wanted to do something in policy. I thought I was still interested in psychology, but also medicine, psychiatry, something like that. But I knew there weren't very many jobs in that. I was very fortunate. I was married at the time, and my ex-husband wanted to go to grad school, so it was sort of, I had had my turn, and he was working, and this would be his turn. So he wanted to go to University of Wisconsin, and I came across a program there, a postdoc, that was sponsored by the National Institute of Mental Health, that was for people in the social sciences. And so I thought, hey, maybe I could get into that. And I did. They had to get some special waiver from, I don't know if it was HEW at that time or Health and Human Services, but to consider someone with a JD, a doctorate, but they, Juris Doctor. So I got into that, and it was fantastic. It was 2 years. I was with people, an anthropologist, sociologist, psychologist, people from different social sciences who had PhDs who were interested in psychiatry. And we were in the psychiatry department at UW. And so that gave me 2 more years to write. I wrote my first article there. It turned out at the law school they had, at the university they had a very good medical ethics program. Norm Faust was the one for medicine, Dan Wickler, John Robertson. So I was able to take some more courses related to my interests. So that was fantastic. I learned a lot. While I was in Madison doing the postdoc, the federal district court judge there, James Doyle, got funding to have a new law clerk. And there was someone there who only wanted to do it part-time because she had a child. And so somehow I heard about this and I thought, well, maybe I could do it part-time and still have the postdoc. So I did that. So I had 1 year of a pure postdoc, 1 year of a mixed clerkship postdoc, and then I became his regular clerk for another year. And he was the closest thing to a saint I've ever met. He was just a wonderful person. He was so kind and genuinely interested in everyone, from the janitor in the courthouse, every defendant. I mean, he really did have a reputation. He let in a lot more pro se clients who were mainly prisoners representing themselves, and he wrote beautifully, beautiful opinions about that. He was just a wonderful role model. I think he reinforced humility, and he made me want to be like him, He had two clerks, and he made us feel as though we knew as much as he did, which of course was far from true. He helped with writing. He helped me, try to be more clear. It was interesting in that I hate to say this, but most of the briefs we got from the lawyers in the cases were not very good. So we started from scratch basically on these problems that he had to rule on. And so obviously doing legal research and thinking about how to decide something, wonderful experience.
So while you were clerking for this judge and becoming a better person.
I'm not sure about that, but I was learning how to be a better person.
Okay. We all need those people in our lives.
He also, the things he said about writing, I still remember I use with my students, such as, don't say things like interestingly, because if it's interesting, the reader will know that. Don't use and/or. Say X or Y or both. He was just a great teacher, because otherwise, why would I remember these things? I've been so lucky in that I've drifted into just the right things. So I assume I must have had a little bit of agency. I mean, I definitely knew what I didn't want to do, and the things I, quote, drifted into were things that interested me. But I never really had a plan, and I ended up in a beautiful place for me. So I feel so lucky about that. In any event, I did decide that I wanted to teach. So then I got the fellowship at University of Chicago Law School. And that was a really good baby teaching job. We taught the students, law students, research and writing. And and it was a maybe class of about 30, a couple of classes, different classes of students. And so that gave us teaching experience. Also, if you have to teach something, that's when you really learn it. So I learned a lot more about research and writing. The professors there were certain ones who would, they all invited us to sit in on classes that we thought we might want to teach eventually. They're in law school, as in most college disciplines, professional disciplines, nobody ever teaches you how to teach. So this was an opportunity at least to have, we weren't sitting in the classes as students because then you don't pick up much of that at all. But sitting there as observers, watching how people taught, so that was very helpful. There's a professor there named Norval Morris who had taught criminal law, but also law and psychiatry and things I was interested in. So he really held my hand, and let me teach a couple of his classes, and it was a great experience.
So 1983, which were pretty heady times for research ethics and bioethics. What was that like?
Well, when I went on the teaching market, I looked at both law teaching and, medical ethics teaching, and I really ended up in a good place in that I was full-time in med school in a center for ethics, interdisciplinary. So I did a lot of learning on the job there too, with case conferences in the ICU. And I remember the very first week I was there, I watched a bypass being performed. I didn't really have a medical background, and so that was pretty. I remember I had to sit down at one point.
Is this the first time, though, ethics has been part of what you were doing as your...
Well, when I was in the postdoc, and I mentioned I wrote my first article, it was in Ulysses contracts in psychiatry. So, and the way I got into that idea was Dan Wickler, who was a philosopher there at UW in the medical ethics program. Remember I said that I got involved with the people in that program. So I also started going to some of their activities in medical ethics, and I got hooked. And so I wrote this article about he and a psychiatrist proposed this idea for a Ulysses contract where somebody with an episodic mental illness could make a contract with the psychiatrist saying, if I exhibit X behavior, spend too much money on my credit card, don't go to work regularly, whatever, you may hospitalize me against my will, even though I don't meet the legal standards for civil commitment. So here I am, fresh out of law school, and my civil liberties notions were, I was just outraged by this idea that you could bypass the law. So I wrote this law review article responding to that called Ulysses and the Psychiatrist, a legal and ethical analysis of voluntary commitment contracts. So that had a lot of ethics in it. And so, ideally we hope that law and ethics have some overlap, right? So as I was finding areas where there was overlap. And so then when I went down to Baylor, I started working on an article about legal and ethical issues in treating anorexia patients. And again, all of my law articles are always legal and ethical, or they're usually more ethical and policy with not very much law. So, I think even in law school, I was just interested in, well, what's right and wrong about that, and what should we be thinking about with an issue. Going back to my father's death, I think this was not conscious, but I think having gone through that experience, I developed a fascination with end-of-life issues, medical issues, illness, and so forth. And so I remember when I was a welfare worker and I was planning on applying to law school, that was the year that Quinlan was being decided in New Jersey. And I was living in Ithaca, New York, and so I remember Cornell Law School had a program at night on the case, and I went to it, and I was just fascinated. And so I think, I was thinking, I'd love to do something in this area. And that was even before I went to law school. So that's, and then I had my psychology background, so there's overlap. But I do think that childhood experience created an interest that I wasn't conscious of necessarily, but I think that's definitely guided me. And I still find today that, if I'm reading the Times, I'm most interested in the science and the health sections. That's my thing. I never wanted to be a doctor or a nurse. I was at Baylor Medical School for 5 years, full-time in a medical school. So that was very good because I learned a lot about the nuts and bolts, how things happen in a tertiary medical center, which isn't representative of all medicine, but high-powered, research-oriented, that sort of thing. And then after that, I went to Case Western Reserve and had a joint appointment in the law and medical schools. I was half and half. And there I was part of a biomedical ethics center. So and then now at Washington University, I have a joint appointment in law and medicine. So ever since I went to Case Western in 1988, I have been teaching law students and medical students about law and medicine and medical ethics.
Have you noticed a change in the questions that the students are asking over this period of time?
I haven't thought about that. Not really. I think the issues persist. I mean, obviously, new developments in science, so things like stem cell research are hot now that didn't exist back then. But even early on, embryo research was an issue. So, I mean, the issues, the ethical and legal issues aren't that different.
When Science Offers Salvation, that was published in 2001, I read it a couple years ago, and I thought it was a remarkable description of myself. Because I've been a patient-centered advocate for 20 years in the pediatric oncology world. And again, it was one of those things where I was like, I thought I was unique and had come up with all these things by myself, and then here you are describing them so eloquently. I was really grateful for that.
Well, it's very good to hear that from a real advocate because, I was approaching this as an academic, although my heart was with you. I, did a lot of reading and talking to people and going to meetings and hearing advocates. But I was always like, do I really know what I'm talking about?
There were some pointed criticisms, I think, of observations about the downside or the less functional side of advocacy organizations. And I want to say that I recognize exactly what you were talking about.
Oh, thank you.
I had the complete sense that you were supportive and happy that there were advocates. I appreciated a level-headed observation of the flaws of the system and of the pitfalls that we see as we go down the path trying to help our people. So we're almost 15 years down the line. Have you noticed any change? Mm-hmm. Have you observed any change in the field of advocacy since you wrote this book?
Well, I do think there are more advocates in the system. I went to a great meeting about a year ago, research advocates, and the people there are very sophisticated about the science. They also talked about things they had done, at the NCI, and I mean, they're really in there, and I think they're really making a difference. And I think many people have a level-headed view of things, and they have the drive to help patients, but they also know that sometimes things like scientific methodology and hope in miracles is not the best way to help people in the long run. So I think there are some very impressive people out there. I think there were back then too with HIV/AIDS, and I wrote about them. And I mean, Fran Visco with breast cancer, I've always admired her. I think she's always had a good.
What do you think of the impact of the internet and the large amounts of information it has
Yeah.
had?
Well, there are lots of gullible people out there. Um, we were just talking about access to investigational drugs and this whole right to try movement, where it's really grassroots and state legislators who maybe aren't very well informed or interested in promoting themselves politically are latching on to this idea that something that's been through phase one really has a reasonable chance of saving an advanced patient's life. And, every once in a while there is some help, but overall, and I'm sort of depressing to see that still going on. On the other hand, I don't know that I don't want to blame people. I think part of the contribution, I don't want to say fault, is the scientific community, which continues to talk about their work with a lot of hype. I mean, of course, I'm stereotyping, so I think that there are many people in clinical research and in basic science who talk about their work appropriately reserved, in an appropriately reserved way. But there are others who promote this idea, and when desperate people hear things like that, they latch on to it. And then, of course, the internet creates opportunities for all sorts of, quote, entrepreneurs to take advantage of people. Oh, I would love to be involved in uh, some kind of I don't want to say training program, but a program where we could get a lot of people from ethics as well as researchers with patient advocates and really sit down and sort of teach each other, because I do think the advocates have things to teach the professionals. In fact, my current book project is about research from the subject's perspective, and I should say subjects S apostrophe, not apostrophe S, because I think there are diverse views. But I'm really trying to read and hear, talk to some extent, people who have been in research and learned from them about ethics, what we should be doing, different ways of doing things. So if I had $1 million, I probably need more than $1 million, $10 million or something, I would love to set something up like that. Well, as I say in the beginning of the book, well, I mean, even when I was diagnosed, I noticed that, I had spent many years teaching medical students about breaking bad news, how to have these conversations. So when it was happening to me, for whatever reason, in retrospect, I can't understand it, but I had symptoms, but I never really thought, consciously at least, that it was cancer. So this was a total shock. I almost passed out when the doctor said, I'm not sure, but I think it could be cancer. I was overwhelmed. On the other hand, there's a little ethicist sitting on my shoulder saying, oh, he's breaking bad news. And observing it from that point of view. I don't know if that shows I'm crazy or what, but that was there. So, there was the professional side, and it was fascinating to be in the middle of things that I had been teaching about. And I learned so much about the reality of being a patient. I was invited to be in a trial, so I have a chapter in there about saying no to a trial, and why I did, and what I learned. When I was asked to be in the trial, it was after they had presented the tumor board recommended treatment, and then my doctor said, but there is this trial option my patients can take. So he described the trial to me. It was very clear, drew pictures. He was excellent. And one thing I know right away, I was desperate to start treatment. I had stage 3, 4. I had this tumor in my tongue. It was very painful. I could hardly eat. So I was desperate to start something. And I said, well, if I decided to go in the trial, it would probably delay my treatment, right? Because then I'd have to, this was just a preliminary discussion. So then I'd have to meet with the study person and be randomized and all. And he said, well, yeah, probably would. So number one, I didn't like that. And the second thing was the tumor board had recommended a very rigorous approach. They said if you weren't relatively young and in good health, we wouldn't suggest this. But it was 4 chemo drugs and then chemo plus radiation therapy, very tough. One of the 4 drugs was a drug that had just been approved for my kind of cancer. The study had 2 arms, 3 cancer drugs plus chemoradiation, or only chemoradiation. And it didn't have that 4th drug that had just been, partly because the trial had been started 5 or 6 years before. You know how cancer trials are so long. So it made me realize that maintaining equipoise in cancer trials, you can't have precise, because with cancer there's all this new stuff and the trials take so long. So those were 2 amazing things I had never known about research that I learned from my personal experience. You know, the idea in the trial was that maybe with less treatment, you could still have the same or equal or, I don't know, perhaps better outcome survival-wise, but also side effect-wise, wouldn't be so burdensome. But here I am as a patient, I had survival, you know, and I like to work out, I thought I was strong, I could take it, you know, and my doctor had recommended this. So also this tension between physician and physician investigator. And as I wrote in the book, my perception when I said, I know I should probably do this, in my chapter I also write about this, did I have a duty to volunteer? Because obviously I knew the benefits of research. I said, I probably should do this, but I don't want to. And he looked at me and said, I totally understand. And he seemed relieved. So I think he really wanted me, and he's read my chapter and he didn't argue with me about that. So he was experiencing this tension that I had read about, you know, that the physician investigator experiences. So it was just so amazing. Um, Deciding what treatment to have. I wrote about in there about refusing a feeding tube for too long and all these things. And so while I was sick, or, you know, during treatment, I was pretty sick for some of it, but I had NPR on all the time. So these doctors came on and were talking about they were cancer doctors and they had become cancer patients, and they talked about how much they learned from that. And I was lying there in my half-conscious state of, oh, we could do that with ethics. I just think there's a dimension to when it becomes personal. Now, maybe if a doctor has somebody in his or her family, the very sensitive ones over time become close to patients, and I think they learn a lot that way, and maybe they listen to their patients. Well, that's why we wrote the book. We hope that maybe some ethicists and clinicians, you know, who read it would see that what they need to do. I think a lot of it is about, I wouldn't necessarily criticize clinicians and ethicists alone. I think it's whenever somebody has a profession where you have to deal with, I don't want to say work with people who are in very tough situations. In order to function, you put up these boundaries, and we even teach a course to the med students on professional boundaries, you know, when it's appropriate to maintain them and what crossings are okay and good. So I think a lot of clinicians and ethicists, I see this all the time, and I just want to shake my colleagues. oh, well, this is how we should do it, and I'm talking about beneficence and justice, and they don't want to open themselves up to the real pain, the real confronting mortality that people are going through. You know, Susan Sontag, when she wrote her book on illness as metaphor, she starts out at the beginning talking about there's a kingdom of the well and a kingdom of the sick. And when you're sick, you're in this completely different kingdom. You feel very isolated. A few people, she didn't say this, but you know, I mean, I know I felt that way, and my colleagues, we talked about that in the book. It's hard for people to reach across. So it's the professional boundaries. It's so I think lawyers do this when they're, say, family lawyers working with people getting divorces. I'm sure pastors, it's a similar problem. Probably even architects, you know. Um, and it's the rare person who finds that perfect balance to even let down his or her guard enough to say, oh, I can really feel some of this. And that makes me think about the fact that I'm going to die and I'm probably going to get sick and my loved ones are. When you're trying to do your work, I think it's hard to let that stuff in. It's going to confuse things. It's going to make people less, quote, efficient. I mean, I was fortunate to have, especially one oncologist who did that pretty well. I mean, I remember the first time I went to him, this was a chemotherapy oncologist. His first meeting with me, and he's the one who talked to me about the trial. He said, well, let's go over and look at your tumor. So he put it up on the computer. And he was the only one who ever sort of said, okay, this is not just my tumor, it's your tumor. And then I remember after just 3 weeks of chemo, and I went to see him, he was so happy. He put up the first one, and then he put up the second one, where the first one was very dark and stark, the tumor. Second one, it was kind of gray, and it was being affected. So that was fantastic. So he really made me feel that he was in an alliance with me. And I remember even something silly, like one time he rushed in and he had a bag of potato chips. And he said, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't have time for lunch and, I shouldn't be eating. And I was like, oh, you're a human being too, I was happy to have him have his potato chips. And so it's a gift, and, the frustration is, could we teach it to more people? There are, there's this one program, what is the name of it? It's focused on teaching doctors to break bad news and spikes. And so each letter stands for something you should do with patients. And I think those things have limits, but I think they certainly can make people better, physicians better. I think the whole movement in narrative medicine is an effort to bring patient stories, and even clinicians telling their stories, I think is a humanizing experience. So I'm really happy that journals like JAMA and the New England Journal will have these accounts where doctors show themselves to be human, sometimes even patients get to write, and they should have more of those. I think there's a recognition among some people in the medical profession that this is needed. Ethics, there's some recognition, but I don't think there's enough about the value of stories and showing people, the professionals, how ethics is experienced by patients and subjects. Well, I think humans love stories. And also, maybe it's a reaction to the more data-driven approaches that medicine is taking. I think it's definitely a reaction to even traditional medicine, where there is this wide distance and this notion of professionalism is so removed. I think maybe it's more. I think in ethics, more of us are aging and having some of these experiences. I know even early on, people like Carol Levine writing about her husband who had serious injury. I mean, people did it, and I'm hoping it's a trend. If you think back to patients' rights in the 70s, that really bubbled up because people were being put on machines and mostly, I think, their families, but even patients themselves, when they were still capable, were just finding themselves in the middle of this kind of a machine. And they sort of, this isn't what I want, and listen to me. And the whole death with dignity, that was a patient family driven movement. I actually think that's been an integral part of bioethics from the beginning. And in fact, I think maybe bioethics was more human, more focused on the human and the patient. If you think of the patient as person, is that Paul Ramsey? And a lot of that was, I think, more patient-centered. And then as the field developed, it became more academic. And so I think in the malignant, in the book, we talked about how we hope that this is something that will call bioethics back to this approach, this earlier approach, because it's become so professionalized.
So narrative is a means maybe to bring bioethics back to a
Patient-centered, person-centered, subject-centered, yeah. I think it could be.
What personality traits or skill sets of yours have been helpful to you throughout your career?
Well, I'm a very shy person, and so I don't think that's been helpful. I think with experience, I've been able to, I hope, get past some of that. But it's something sorry, I still struggle with in that I find writing a more comfortable mode of communication. I think one of the virtues of getting older is that I am more comfortable engaging people face to face and in class. But I think it's been more of trying to get past an ingrained trait I have, so that's not been a helpful trait. I do, maybe it's again because of my childhood experience, I have always identified with the patient, the patient's family, the outsider. And I think in research ethics, I've always, being, on the IRB, I'm always the non-scientist. So I've always felt like an outsider in the medical research system. I mean, I am an outsider. I have no particular science background, anything. So it's easier for me to see the side of the patient and the patient family and the outsider. So maybe that's something that's, I don't know if it's been helpful, but it's certainly been formative. I have to say, when I look at, I was looking at the program for Primer, and also just being, a longtime IRB member. I think it's the education system, the compliance aspect, the accreditation has been beneficial in that it's reduced the uniformity. I mean, it's increased the uniformity. So it's addressed some of the substandard things that were going on because nobody was like teaching people on IRBs and so forth about the basics. And so now everybody is more in touch with the basics. On the other hand, I wish we still had more time and effort devoted to the sort of the tough questions, the real ethical dilemmas, the things that you can't just have a checkbox for. The hard questions, the things that I think I'm not singling out Primer, but Primer and other bioethics conferences focus more on in the good old days, you know. And I'm not saying it was the good old days; it was the bad old days in some ways. So, I don't know, in some ways, maybe it parallels this whole debate about evidence-based medicine. I think that's a very good thing in that there are a lot of clinicians out there practicing in ways that are not based on good evidence, and patients are suffering from that. So you reduce that by using requirements for evidence-based medicine. On the other hand, lots of physicians are saying, but wait a minute, you're taking the heart of medicine out of it. It's becoming a cookbook. So I've even noticed on our IRB, I think we do a much better job. The staff is so good now at pre-screening, and it makes being a member so much easier. But I have a sense not every meeting, but many meetings, we just click through it, and then that's it. And we don't agonize over anything anymore. And I think we need to keep agonizing. I don't think there are simple answers. Well, as I mentioned, I'm very proud of *Malignant* because it's something different, different from any of the writing I've ever done. Most of the writing I have done and continue to do is more, quote, objective, and this obviously, *Malignant* had a high personal component. I loved being able, with 6 wonderful colleagues, to sit down. We had 2 meetings where we hashed out. It was a combination of a support group and a professional meeting, and we talked about what we'd been through and then analyzed it. So for the rest of us, it was easier for us to sort of put on our hats as ethicists and say, "Whoa, what did you think about this?" Or, that was so stimulating, and we taped it, and then I had a transcript made, and I love that transcript because it's just such a fascinating discussion, and that was the basis for the book. So I loved being able to put the personal professional together, and that really got me interested now in my current project, which is looking at research from subject perspectives. One of the chapters in *Malignant* is about being invited to be in a study, and so I've been reading accounts by people who have been in research about their side of it, lots of empirical work, interviews with subjects, especially qualitative research. The surveys and so forth can be good, but I really value the research about that allows subjects to bring things up themselves, because I think that's where you really learn about what it looks like from their perspective. And so now I'm trying to put the two together and say, here's what we can learn. So one chapter is arguing that researchers and everyone involved in research oversight should volunteer for studies regularly. Not be forced to do it, but find ones that fit them and just do that. As I think that would be as valuable an educational experience as any of these training things that we go through. I mean, we should have both. So that's a way of bringing personal experience. See, in research, in a way, it's a little bit easier to have personal experience than it is as a patient. I mean, everybody's a patient, and if a professional is a patient, even in ordinary care, I think you can learn a lot about how the doctor will talk to you, and then you walk out of there and somebody says, well, what did the doctor say? And you say, well, I have no idea. So anybody whose eyes are open can learn about being a patient. Maybe not in the life-threatening situation, but anyway, in research we can put ourselves in a position to have a personal experience. And certainly I'm not saying that should be only, the only thing, and certainly being in one study is not going to teach you everything, and being in the study as a person who knows about research is going to be different from somebody who is new to it. But I think it's one way to get a glimpse of what the subjects go through. One of the wonderful things about that Primer has done that very few other organizations have done in ethics or medicine, I think, is to always have at least one session where you're having subjects present their view. Now, this conference, it's someone from the Lax family. But usually in the past several years, they've had the living room conversation with subjects. And that's been such a valuable resource for me. And I really hope Primer continues that, and I wish that more professional organizations would give opportunities for people outside the profession to say, here's what it looks like from our vantage point. I think community engagement, participant-centered research, there are also efforts that are related to that. And obviously there are lots of sessions here on that. But I hope that along with the data-driven, and also there's this movement, very anti-IRB, anti-oversight movement that's getting stronger, and I'm surprised that some of my colleagues are jumping on this bandwagon. I find that upsetting. Now, I'm not saying that researchers do not have to deal with silly things because of oversight, but I see the pendulum sort of swinging way too far away from saying, okay, let's see what we can do about reducing the silly things, making it more user-friendly for researchers. I think a lot of people are working on that, but I don't understand this more nihilist trend that we're seeing. And I hope that doesn't get too much power.